Polar bear migration is one of the most extraordinary events in the natural world and offers a rare glimpse into the lives of these unique animals. Once again, we've planned a mix of educational webcasts and fun casual live chats aboard Tundra Buggy 1, the vehicle I'm in right now, with polar bears just outside, providing a window into the Arctic for all those who are interested in polar bears. Today's educational webcast is Ice Bears Around the World. Our target audience is elementary school age students, but all are welcome to join and learn and ask questions. This program will last about 20 or 30 minutes, and we will include time for questions. We encourage you to use the chat window below if you're on the Polar Bears International website, or you could use comments within social media. And I am the Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International. I am happy to introduce our two special guests today, Kristen Ladra and Eric Regier, both from the University of Washington. Kristen, do you mind just taking a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks a lot. It's great to be here today. My name is Kristen Ladra. I'm a polar bear biologist that works at the University of Washington, and my research is focused on polar bear subpopulations around Greenland.
And Eric.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you, BJ. I wish we were out there live with you on the Tundra Buggy, but my name's Eric Regier. I'm also a scientist here at the University of Washington. I've been studying polar bears for about 20 years, and currently my research is focused in Russia and some in Canada as well.
So this is perfect. As you notice, both of these people have worked in far places around the globe. Polar bears live in the north. And if KT could bring up the circumpolar map, and maybe Kristen, you could maybe talk a little bit about the 5 countries where we find polar bears.
Sure. Shall I? Okay, here's the map. Great. So polar bears distributed around the circumpolar Arctic. That means they're all around basically the northern part of the globe. And polar bears can be found in the US, in Canada, in Greenland, in Svalbard, which is part of Norway, and in Russia. So those are the 5 nations that have polar bear populations, and those nations have different numbers of subpopulations among them.
How many subpopulations are there of polar bears, and why do we have them?
Yeah, so currently we have 19 subpopulations of polar bears around the Arctic, and those are basically sort of like lines drawn on a map that delineate where bears tend to be clustered, and it delineates how different bears are. So basically those subpopulations are defined by how bears move around. They're defined by the genetics of polar bears, so how related they are within that subpopulation and across different subpopulations, and also in some cases by traditional knowledge.
So Eric, you've spent some time in Alaska, you spent some time in Canada, you spent some time in Russia. Could you tell bears apart? Are these bears physically different from each other in each of these populations, or are they really basically the same animal across all of them?
You know, BJ, that's a great question. You know, bears, first, every individual bear is unique. If you think of having a dog or a cat and you spend a lot of time with them and you get to know their personalities, in my experience, bears have their own individual attributes like that. So each bear is unique. You see some bears in the wild that are playful and goofy. You see some bears that are very, very serious. You see some bears that are very grumpy, and some bears that are very shy. So each individual bear is different, just like people. In these 19 subpopulations, there are some differences between bears in one group, one subpopulation versus another. For example, up in Alaska, west of Alaska, is a place called the Chukchi Sea, and the bears there tend to be very, very big. Some of the biggest bears in the Arctic, because there's just a lot for them to eat there, and it's a good place to be. There's some other parts of the Arctic, other groups of bears where the bears might be smaller or they might be shaped a little different. So there are some group-based differences around the Arctic. But despite these individual differences and subpopulation or group-based differences, there are some features that are common to all polar bears. What makes a polar bear is basically having the sea ice to live on. It's the most important part of their habitat. It's where they spend a lot of their lives, and it's where they do most of their hunting. So wherever you find a polar bear, whether it's Alaska or Russia or Western Hudson Bay, sometimes they spend some time on land when they rest on land or when there's no ice. But at the end of the day, all of these bears need sea ice to be polar bears.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and we talk a lot about it here. And if we look out the window, what's happening here? I don't think most people would believe that we would get sea ice here in Churchill, Manitoba. It's a pretty warm day here, and these bears are just hanging out on the beach, waiting for the sea ice to freeze. I didn't even really have to wear a jacket this morning when I left the house. And yet this whole place will freeze, and then these bears will take off. So Eric, can you talk again just a little bit about once they get out on the sea ice, what are they doing? What is out there that allows them to survive and live? What's their primary food source?
Yeah, so it's interesting. If once the sea ice reforms and the ice refreezes, you could look out over the ice, out over the frozen ocean, and you'd see almost nothing except ice and more ice. And so you think, wow, there's not much happening out here, but there's tons of life happening out in the frozen ocean. It's just that a lot of that life is under the ice in the water. So there's planktons in the water, there's fish, and then there are seals. And the seals eat the fish in the water. And what happens is the seals then come up through the ice to breathe, or they have little snow caves that they build on top of the ice under snow. And when those seals come up from the water to the top of the ice, that's when polar bears can catch and eat the seals. So the number one food source for polar bears throughout the Arctic is seals, ice-associated seals. And what these seals do is they take all of that energy, all of that food from the water, they eat it, they get fat themselves, and they come up onto the ice and represent the main food source for polar bears. So when the ice reforms there in Western Hudson Bay, all these bears that spent the summer and part of the autumn on land, where they're basically hanging out, waiting for the ice to reform. Once the ice forms, they'll walk right out on it and start hunting seals to the extent that they can. They'll stay out on the ice all winter, and then the best time for polar bears is in the spring, in April, May, June, and that's when they do the most hunting of seals. That's when the seal species have their young, which polar bears will prey on a lot. But anytime they're out on the ice, if they can, they'll be interested in hunting seals.
So Kristen, I guess we could say that these bears here in Hudson Bay have a certain strategy. Of course, they're forced off of the ice when it melts in the summertime or in the springtime. They have to make some decisions on when they're going to come on shore, how long they're going to spend on the ice, kind of when they're going to jump off and swim and start their fasting period. So that's kind of an interesting strategy. The place that you've done a lot of work there in East Greenland, do bears have a unique strategy there for survival?
Yeah, I would say that, how bears make a living. Of course, as Eric said, all bears need ice and all bears fundamentally need to prey on seals to survive. But it kind of varies around the Arctic depending on the patterns of the ice. So, for example, in East Greenland, where we've been working for the last several years, East Greenland is a source of lots of ice that actually comes down from the Arctic basin, and it flows through a place called Fram Strait, and the ice flows all the way down the coast of East Greenland. So in some places year-round, there's actually ice available to polar bears. Now that ice might draw kind of northward towards the pole in summer, as you can see actually on this great video, and it extends southward during winter. So the bears might actually be following that. But in some areas, they're able to be on the ice year round. Now, in other parts of East Greenland, bears are actually stranded in the fjords. when the ice breaks up. And so they have to rely either on similar strategies that you see in Western Hudson Bay, where bears are just waiting on land for things to refreeze, or in some cases use the freshwater ice.
That's great. So we've actually, this is a perfect question that just came in through Twitter. What months of the year are bears on ice versus months of the year that they're on land? Maybe Eric, you could talk a little bit about both Alaska and Russia, where you've spent a lot of time.
Yeah, that's a great question. The simplest answer is the bears are going to be on ice whenever there is ice for the most part. And so the time of the year that there is ice varies around the Arctic. In Alaska, north of Alaska, where I've worked, um, the ice that's near the coast will start melting in June or July, and it will refreeze in say late October. And so, in that part of the world, north of Alaska, some of the bears, when that ice melts, will come on shore. So they'll be on shore all the way, say, from July to October. Now, as Kristen said, in some parts of the world and in Alaska, the bears actually have a choice. So they can decide to get off the ice when it melts near shore and wait on shore, or as the ice kind of retreats up into the polar basin, far, far north to the North Pole. So some of the bears will actually stay on the ice when it moves up and melts up toward the North Pole. So the bears have that choice to make. Similarly, in Russia, where I work, most of the bears in the Chukchi Sea subpopulation will choose to get off the ice when it melts near shore. The near shore ice melts. They'll come onto the coast of Russia, or especially onto this island in Arctic Russia called Wrangel Island, where hundreds and maybe thousands of polar bears will get off the ice in July when it melts, and they'll stay on Wrangel Island until October or November until it refreezes. So it really depends on the part of the Arctic. In parts of the Arctic where there's ice, sea ice year round, the polar bears will generally stay on the ice year round. In parts of the Arctic where kind of the best ice habitats melt, the polar bears often are forced to get off and spend a few months, 3, 4, 5 months on land. Or in some cases, far north, they have the opportunity or the option to stay on the ice as it melts far, far north toward the North Pole, and then kind of comes back again, refreezes toward the coast in the autumn.
So the bears that we're looking at here outside the window in Churchill, they got off the ice sometime in late June, early July, somewhere around there, and they've been kind of hanging out on land here, waiting for their ice to freeze. We see some caribou outside the window. I know that there's moose in the forest nearby. We've got friends that go out hunting for these moose. I mean, Kristen, why don't these bears just walk inland and maybe try to get a caribou or moose? That seems like there would be a lot of good food for an animal like this.
Yeah, good question. I mean, polar bears have really evolved to use the ocean as their food source. They're marine mammals, and they're the only bear that's a marine mammal, and specifically because they're out in the marine ecosystem finding food. The big reason for that is that polar bears need fat or blubber, scientifically often called lipids, that basically kind of gives them this super intense, calorically rich energy they need to be a polar bear and survive in the Arctic. Now, that's not to say that a caribou or moose wouldn't be a good meal for a polar bear. And I think there are even some recent observations that they could, if they wanted to, take a caribou and eat it. But it's really this lipid-rich or this blubber-rich diet that allows polar bears to survive in the Arctic, and you get that from hunting super fat seals on the ice.
So that's really the way to survive. That's the only way to grow an animal as big as a polar bear in this environment, huh? You have to just eat fat.
Yeah.
I like it. So that question actually about going inland and hunting caribou also came in from Twitter. So thanks for the shout out there, folks. And if you've got more questions, please place them in the chat or use the social media channels to send them our way. And we'll get those over to Eric and Kristen. I think this is a really, really interesting question from someone out there, also from Twitter. And they're asking, how do polar bears stay hydrated in this environment if everything is frozen? Do either one of you know the answer to that?
Do you know, Eric?
So it's I'm getting put on the spot here. This isn't my area of expertise, but yeah, it's tricky because yeah, what do they drink? You can't drink seawater, and all the snow and everything on the surface is frozen. So the basic answer is comes back down to fat. Like Christian talked about, these polar bears rely on these fat seals to get the energy that they need. And when their body breaks down or metabolizes the fat, it's able to actually produce water. So that seal there, there's a lot of stuff inside that seal, and some of it's calories and some of it's water, incorporated in the fat molecules. So a lot of their water out on the sea ice, they'll get by catching these seals, eating the seals, and then their body is well adapted to turn some of that fat into the water that they need to survive.
That's pretty fascinating. I mean, how handy to be able to, make your own water instead of having to carry a water bottle around. I haven't seen too many polar bear water bottles out here, so I think that's pretty neat. So we're talking here a little bit about polar bears living all around the world, across the north in the circumpolar region. The 5 different nations that have these polar bears roaming around. Are all of these polar bears threatened? Are there some bear species that are doing better than others? What are we looking at here when we talk about these 19 subpopulations? Is it kind of one story for all of them, or is it multiple stories throughout the Arctic? I don't know if each of you, maybe starting with Kristen, want to throw in on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So scientists are monitoring not all of these subpopulations, but many of these subpopulations to look at how bears are doing. So what's their body condition? How are their movements changing with respect to loss of sea ice? What are their population numbers? What are the trends in their numbers? And what we see is actually there's quite a bit of variability in how polar bears are doing at the moment. Before I go any further, I'll say that there's a scientific consensus, that as we go forward under climate warming and projected climate change, that will be negative for polar bears all over the Arctic, because polar bears, as you now know, rely so heavily on sea ice. But at the moment, there's variability in how those subpopulations are doing. Some appear to be stable, meaning that looking at trends over time, we don't see declines. Some are definitely declining, and that's largely a result of climate change. And some are actually increasing. So you can see here on this map that just came up on the screen, the colors represent likely declines, likely increases, likely stable. And if it's gray, we don't actually have any information from that subpopulation, or we don't have the ability to look at a trend. So the short answer is it's variable. The kind of bigger picture is that under climate change in the next several decades, it's going to be negative.
Yeah, Eric, I think I would ask you, as Kristen's talking about, we've got these populations that are studied, we understand these numbers and things, but how do we get these numbers? How do we understand so much about some of these populations and not so much about these other ones? What kind of work goes into actually building a full understanding of these populations?
Yeah, BJ, a lot of work by a lot of scientists and managers and communities throughout the Arctic. So one thing about the Arctic that's just hard to imagine is just how huge it is. It's immense. Some of these polar bear subpopulations, we're talking about these 19 groups of bears. Some of these subpopulations, the areas that they cover are bigger than, for Americans, say, the state of Texas. So incredibly huge areas. And it's a really hard challenge to say, okay, how many polar bears are in this area the size of Texas that's covered in sea ice and very cold and very hard to get to? So it is really hard to come up with a good understanding of how many bears are out there, and how well those bears are doing, for example, in relation to climate warming. So scientists and others have developed multiple methods to study polar bears. One of the most common methods is you go out over the sea ice, or you go into polar bear habitat. It usually involves flying out over the sea ice, for example, in the spring in a helicopter. In places like Western Hudson Bay, you can actually use this method in the autumn because all the polar bears are concentrated on land. But basically, you go out and you can individually identify specific bears. So you can see a bear and, for example, use a little biopsy dart to get a little genetic sample, and it'll say, hey, this is bear number 122. You can do a genetic analysis to see which bear it is. Similarly, you can sedate a bear. That means you put it to sleep just for a few minutes, like your dog or cat would get put to sleep at the vet, and you can give the bear a little physical marking. So you can put the little number 122 on this tiny little tattoo on the bear's lip. And so what scientists do is they'll go out year after year for multiple years, and they'll identify some of the individuals in the subpopulation. You can never identify them all. In some subpopulations, there's 2,000 bears or 3,000 bears, and they're so far out and there's so many of them you can't get to them, but you can identify some. And then what you do is you do this type of study a few years in a row. So you got the first year, the second year, and the third year. And then after you have several years, you start to see patterns. For example, if you went out the first year and identified 100 bears, and then you went out the second year and identified, you saw another 100 bears, and it was the exact same 100. You'd think, okay, wow, I saw the exact same bears 2 years in a row. There must only be about 100 bears out there. But if the first year you identify 100, give them their little markings. If you come out next year and you only find one or two of the ones you've already seen, but you find 98 new ones, you think, okay, wow, there have to be a lot out here to have not re-seen the same one. So that's basically one of the methods that scientists use to try to estimate how many polar bears are in these different areas.
This sounds like a massive team effort. I mean, to be able to even just have a few of the subpopulations marked well enough that you can count them. I mean, these are a lot of people going out in the field year after year after year to mark these things, mark these animals that really probably don't really want to be found. I mean, they're out there living their life in a place that's very, very remote. I mean, this is fascinating. I think as we're talking about the science here, I just want to shift a little bit towards, you guys have done this work. Both of you have been these people in the field year after year, marking these bears, counting these bears. I'm wondering if Kristen, if you have any favorite stories, and then I'll come over to you, Eric, from the field, if you've got anything you'd like to share with folks out there. Putting you on the spot, I know.
Oh yeah, you are. It's so hard when you get this question because I honestly feel so privileged. I've seen so many amazing places and amazing things that it's hard to pick. I mean, some of the recent experiences I've had in East Greenland, we were flying in the far northeast Greenland, and we found an area that was clearly a maternity denning area, meaning that many of the females had clearly spent the winter in maternity dens and given birth and come out onto the ice with their new cubs. And we, just in a couple days, we found maybe 10 or up to 12 sets of females with young cubs that are, very small and just really amazing to see. So that was a recent experience that was very special, but I find it very difficult to pick my favorite.
That's pretty special. And we're going to be talking about that later in our webcast here, why you need young bears in order to build bear populations. So to be able to see 10 family groups like that, that is pretty cool. Really neat.
Yeah.
Eric, what do you have? Do you have some neat experiences you'd like to share?
Oh, it's yeah, like as Kristen said, it's hard to pick, but there's some really neat stuff. For example, one year we were doing research in Alaska, in America, and we found this bear for research and we sedated it. That means, again, we put it to sleep for 20, 30 minutes so we could, take its an assessment of its health and give it some markings. And as I was saying earlier, one of the markings we actually give bears sometimes is this little plastic ear tag. It looks like a little earring kind of, and it has a number on it. And so one time we went out in Alaska one year and we captured a bear for research and took our samples and released it. And the very next year, I was in Russia, and I was on this island, Wrangel Island, where a lot of the bears spend the summer. And I saw a bear with an ear tag, and it was only 20, 30 feet away. And I could see the ear tag and figure out that it was the same bear in Russia that I'd seen 1 year ago in America. And so I thought that was really neat, because it just makes the point that even though the Arctic's so huge, these bears, they can move a lot. They can have huge areas that they use, and so in a way, even though they're huge, it's all connected. What happens to the sea ice in one part of the Arctic affects other parts. What happens as far as, say, human development and activity in one part of the Arctic can affect polar bears in other parts. So that was I think pretty neat to see. As far as of course, I think everybody that's kind of done this research for a while has a bunch of other stories, some funny and some scary. But one of the neatest things is just to see that environment and how incredible it is. And so, like Kristen, I felt just very privileged to get up there and just be able to spend time in that Arctic environment and try to appreciate it. It's a place that is very hard to get to, and a lot of people can't get to, and which is why one of the reasons it's so great that PBI and others like have these webinars, have these live streams, so people can get a glimpse into this Arctic and become interested in it and interested in protecting it.
I think that's really great. We've got a ton of good questions coming in. Thousand Oaks, California, 4th grade class from Ronan asks, which countries do polar bears live the longest? Any thoughts there? That's a good question.
Well, that's a great question.
I've been doing these webcasts for quite a while now, and this is the first time that I've heard this one come across. So nice work, Ronan. Kristen or Eric. Eric's saying no, he doesn't want this question. He's saying, Kristen, what do you got?
I think that's a great question, and that shows a lot of thought. But the answer is actually that polar bears have the same lifespan no matter what country they live in. So on average, polar bears might live to be around 20 or 25 years old in the wild. They can get a little bit older in some unique cases, but the lifespans don't really vary that much depending on where they live.
Well, that's a good answer. Polar bears they just want that one thing to eat, and that's seals. It's not like people where we have different diets based on where we live, maybe, and the access of food for us. So maybe that has something to do with it. They're just eating one thing there. So that's neat. We got lots of other ones coming in here. Looks like from Josh, if there were no other things to eat, like seals, what else do polar bears? Will they eat anything else? Yeah. What else can polar bears eat? They are bears after all.
Hey Josh, this is Eric. Again, good question. So a polar bear will eat almost anything that it can eat. So these are really adaptable and flexible animals, and so I guarantee if a polar bear walked out on the ice and there was 200 pounds of donuts on the ice, the polar bear would eat the donuts and would love the donuts. It wouldn't be as nutritional as the seals, but the polar bears would eat it. So they'll eat almost anything. That said, like Kristen said, their bodies they have certain requirements that you couldn't fulfill with donuts, for example. And again, there aren't really donuts available in most parts of the Arctic, but they do need these foods that are very high in fat to survive. So as Kristen said, even though in some parts of the Arctic, like there in Western Hudson Bay, there's some caribou around, there's some moose around, there's all these grasses and sedges. If polar bears were cows, they'd be grazing on all this stuff. But the grass just doesn't do much good for a polar bear. Its stomach and its intestines just aren't designed to digest grass. Similarly, they're not like wolves. They can't run very long distances. They're not great long, kind of chase predators. So A, they probably don't have the easiest time catching a caribou, and then B, if they catch the caribou, it's mostly meat. And so it doesn't have this fat that they require. So a bear, any of the bears in North America, brown bears, black bears, polar bears, they'll go ahead and eat almost anything. But it really comes down to what is available. And then is what's available, does it have the specific nutritional requirements of that type of bear? And for polar bears, that's a lot of fat.
I love that. We'll keep an eye out for donuts here on the ice as it forms. Maybe they'll appear. Who knows? That's a great question. Christina's asking, and I like this one, how long does it take for them to hunt their food? How successful are bears out there? How many times does it take them to try before they capture a seal? Do we know this?
It's a great question. I mean, there have been a few studies that have done observations and tried to quantify the amount of hunting attempts that bears make before they actually get a seal. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I would say they spend a lot more time trying and being unsuccessful than they are to actually be successful and get a seal. For example, you have to be completely still and silent. You have to be extremely patient. You probably have to be, to some extent, very lucky to wait by a seal hole, not have the seal detect you, have a seal come up and grab that seal out of the water successfully in order to predate on it. So I think that, and that goes same for when you're walking around on the ice and you're, smashing through the snow dens or the layers to get the young seals. I think that you actually probably try a couple of times before you get successful. But Eric, maybe you know the exact numbers.
I don't. I'd say it's the same thing, just from flying around in the Arctic, you see that slide we just saw was really great because you see the tracks in the snow. And when we fly in helicopters and do this research, you'll see some bears, but you see way, way more tracks. And the tracks are really neat because you can look at this and you can have an idea what the bear did. So what did the bear do in this picture? Well, it looks like there was a small bear, I think, that walked around. It looks like the ice is melted around the seal hole. The bear probably sat there for a long time waiting for a seal, but you don't see any blood. So the bear presumably did not actually catch a seal. So when we fly around, you see a lot of places where the bears tried and much fewer places where they succeeded. So I don't know the numbers either. I think, during most times of the year, these bears will require killing one or two at least seals every few days to survive. And so they have to be at least that successful. But my impression is they spend many, many, many hours trying to catch a seal for every one that they actually catch.
Oh boy, that's fascinating. So I think I want to start wrapping things up a little bit here. And KT's got a nice video that I'd like her to queue up if she will. But what we've learned here today really is that polar bears need sea ice to live. And in order for us to have sea ice, we need cold temperatures in the Arctic, and global climate change is threatening that and changing the Arctic here, reducing the access to sea ice for polar bears. And in some populations, we're seeing reductions. Some of them we're expecting reductions, but ultimately this will affect all of the polar bears in the circumpolar region. We've got a neat little video here that helps sum that up. I wonder if KT, if you could play that for us.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. We hope you leave here feeling inspired and return home to leverage your voice and your influence, because together we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.